Morning, everyone. It's lovely to see lots of different people joining us today. So we've got our wider team also on Zoom, who I'll introduce to us, and you'll be able to see some slides today as we do our virtual National Science Week. And we're all going to learn about meat production.
How do I get the audio?
I'll just mute that person. So hi everyone, my name's Dr Jaime Manning. I'm one of the lecturers in agriculture here at CQUniversity. I'm based in Rockhampton, and you can see on this slide that we've got a broader team that's based also all around Australia. So we've also got Nick and Molly, who are based down in Gippsland. So I know I've got several Gippsland schools that are joining us today. And then we've also got Amy Stoddard, who's also on, who's with me in Rocky. So this is one of our research projects that's looking at trying to raise aspirations or show you some of the different career opportunities that are available in the agriculture sector. But today we're going to do and learn all about meat production and learn about a bit of an introduction to what is meat science and why do we actually care about it. So we've got a couple of different activities that we're going to work through today on Zoom. The first part of this is really going to be focused on a short half-an-hour session, give you an introduction to what is meat judging, what is meat, what are some of the different animals that we get meat from, and ultimately when we go to the supermarket, how do we pick a good piece of steak versus something that might be quite average. The last activity, and we've left the final half an hour for everyone else to, depending on what you're going to work on today, is to do an optional meat tasting activity. So if you're one of our Gippsland schools that's been sent one of the meat tasting kits, you've got some meat to be able to do this activity either in this time slot or later today or later in the week. If you're another school, we've got some handouts, and you can just use some images that are available online to look at some different cuts of meat and learn how do we actually judge them. Or if you're joining us from home or even tonight, maybe go into your freezer, think about what you eat for dinner, and actually do assessments and some judgment based on what we're actually tasting for dinner, or think about what we could try tomorrow and pull out of the freezer and give a bit of a taste. So got lots of different options available for you, and this first part of the lecture is really going to give you some of the information that you need to know before you do that potential meat tasting activity. What we've also got online, and this is just completely optional, is that there's going to be some different questions that pop throughout, and I like using Poll Everywhere. So what you can either do is just sign in on one computer at your school or at home on a new web browser, and so that email link is called pollev.com/Agri-tech933. Otherwise, as on Zoom, you've got down the bottom, you've got the chat function, you can submit your answers, or just have a class discussion when we get to the slides, and you can answer together as a group about where you think some of those meat cuts come from. So lots of different options so that you can all participate today. Before we sort of get into the meat judging aspect, I think it's really important to think about, well, what is meat? And we know when we go to the supermarket or we go to the butcher, we're actually picking a piece of meat, but what is it? And normally it comes from an animal, and meat plays a really important role in our diet. So not only is it a really good protein source, but it also gives us a number of different minerals and vitamins for our diet. We can obviously also get that from other sources like plants and legumes and things like that. But meat normally plays a very big part in our diet. We're going to start off easy and sort of work our way through today. And so when we talk about meat, there's obviously lots of different animals that we can get meat from. And so I've got 4 different examples here. And I just want you as a class to look at those 4 different images. We've got 4 different words. We've got chicken, pork, lamb, and beef. And the first task of today, hopefully you can work out where each of those different species, or what are they? So have a bit of a think about it, look at those, have a bit of discussion, and we'll see what we think. So hopefully we're able to identify that that first one is our pig, and what we get from pigs is pork. We've got our chickens here. And so this chicken here, if you didn't know, there's actually 2 different types of chickens. We've got chickens that give us meat, and we've also got chickens that lay eggs. And so this is known as a broiler chicken that gives us meat, or our chicken meat that we eat. We've got sheep or our lamb, and then cows for beef. So starting off very easy, and then we're going to work our way through it today. So then from each of those different animals, we obviously get different products that we then consume. So again, we've got our chicken, our pork, our lamb, our beef. And what I want you to see if you can work out is how to identify each of those. So some of them are going to be quite easy. It might be something that you eat on a regular basis, so perhaps that chicken breast, where others might be a little bit more challenging. It's also very difficult when we look at photos to work out the actual size of the item. And so if you actually had it in front of you, it's going to be a little bit easier. So we think about how big a cow is and how big their bones are. It's going to be a lot bigger piece of meat than, say, something from a lamb that's a lot smaller as well. So we can look at the size of the bone or the size of that piece of meat to be able to help us. So that first one, in that top left-hand corner, we've got some bacon. So it's from pork. We've got our chicken breast, our beef steak, and then the lamb here is probably the hardest one to be able to identify. And what we're going to do later this morning is actually work out, look at the meat color. And one important aspect when we look at things like lamb and beef is that you actually see a difference in that meat color. So if we look at our beef steak here, we describe it as being that really bright cherry red color, where if we look at that lamb, it's normally not as bright of a red color. It's a slightly different color. And then compared to our chicken, again, it's a lot lighter. So we're able to identify each of those different animals, identify what product it comes from, but now where does it actually come from? So if we talk about our chicken breast and we look at a chicken, there's obviously all different regions of that animal that piece of meat can come from. So this is going to be our first poll everywhere question that you can either use or use the chat function, or just as a group, have a bit of a discussion. So you've got all these different regions on this chicken, and I want to see what your thoughts are when we talk about a chicken breast. Where do you think that chicken breast on that animal might come from? So I can see a couple of people contributing, and if you're using poll everywhere, you can just literally drop your pointer. Otherwise, we'll keep an eye on the chat to be able to see any other responses. See a couple more answers coming through.
Yes, back on.
Okay, so we've got lots of different comments coming through. I've got some people where this little dot's placed. I've got some people are thinking more lower down the legs. Someone thinking it's off the chicken. I think that might have to redo that one. So you can see there's all these different regions of an animal and there's all these different cuts that it comes from. And so when we talk about a chicken breast, it actually comes from that front chest region of our chicken. And obviously it's also going to look very different if you're looking at a whole chicken breast of an animal that's in the supermarket in its packaging to work out where it comes from. But that's where that chicken breast comes from. And then this is probably what we're more familiar with, what it actually looks like when we've cooked it up and we're eating it. So we're moving on to our next one. So we identified that this was a pig. It has pork and we've got some bacon here. Now this one might be a little bit more challenging. Of where on that animal is a lot more regions to pick from. Where do we think that bacon comes from on that animal? I've got a lot of responses coming up now. Okay. So it actually comes from that belly region of the animal. Oh, I can see Simon's class is getting excited. They've got it right. A couple other hands have come up. Good work, everyone. So yeah, it comes from that belly region of that animal. Okay, so we're going to move on now. Now we're going to move on to our lamb. And so what we have here is known as lamb shanks. Here's your picture of what you're more likely to see on your dinner plate. So nice slow cooked meal, really good for winter. But where on that animal does it come from? Now, my first hint to you when we look at this piece of meat here is we've got a bone. So it's obviously going to be somewhere where it's got a bone. We've got our sheep or our lamb here, and where do we think a lamb shank comes from? Lots of responses, which is nice to see. Okay, let's see. So it actually comes from that front leg region. Look, I can see lots of cheering. Look, we're obviously going really, really well, which is nice to see. So that's our lamb shank. Okay, so our final species is going to be our cow or our beef. And so this particular cut, when we look at it, it's called a T-bone steak. And the reason it's called a T-bone steak is you can see this bone here looks like the shape of a T or the letter T. So it's a T-bone steak. We've got our cow. And where do we think our T-bone steak might come from? Okay, I've got a couple of little clusters of points there. So it actually comes from that region just there, which is known as our short loin. So that T-bone steak comes from the short loin region. I've had lots of different points there, so good work, everyone. I think some of you might give some undergrads a run for their money on our meat judging team. So awesome work. So we now know that there's lots of different species that we can get our meat from. We now have a bit of idea that they come from different regions of that animal. And so if you do have any meat samples with you after today, you can use some of those posters that we emailed through of those different regions and see if you can identify any other regions that that particular cut of meat might come from. Or if you don't have any meat with you, that's no trouble at all. Even just go onto the internet, find some pictures of some different cuts of meat. Think about what cuts you eat at home. Do you eat a fillet steak? Do you have a lamb chop? Do you have a lamb cutlet? And then see if you can work out where each of those different cuts belongs. So we now know what meat is. We now know some different species that meat comes from. Now I'm going to give you some basic introduction of terms of judging meat. So one of the first things that we look at when we judge meat, and this is more to do with when we're talking about beef. So I've got some images of some beef steaks on that slide there. And the first one is meat color. And it's actually all these different colors that meat can be. Now I want you to think about when you've gone to the supermarket or before you've cooked a piece of meat, what color do we think that meat looks like? Or what color would you prefer to buy? So here we've got a big range of meat of a variety of different colors. And we've got these color chips on some of those handouts as well for you to practice with if you do have any raw meat samples. Remember, it's going to be really subjective. So it could be quite hard that what color you think it is might be different to what I see. And again, with these color chips, it does look a little bit different on the page versus in real life. But when we talk about meat, what we really want is that bright cherry red color. So really after this nice bright red color, so somewhere around this region here, compared to these darker colors or this sort of maroon colored. And the reason for that is there's lots of different things that go into play or that have an effect on how good that piece of meat is. And one of them is also how stressed that animal was before we sent it to get processed. And so again, we've got to be mindful of how we treat our animals beforehand. So meat color is that first one. The next is that fat color. So when we look at this piece of meat, we can see this fat color here. We can also work out whether it's a white color or a score of 0, all the way to this higher value here, which is that darker yellow color. And if you think about or talk to whoever's sitting next to you about what you'd prefer to see, most people would say that they'd like fat color that's more on that white color as opposed to something that is yellow. Fun fact, it actually has nothing to do with the quality of meat. So whether you pick a piece of meat that has some yellow fat or has a piece of white fat, it's actually not going to affect the taste of it. It's all just about perception, about what you actually visually like to see on your plate. So that's the second thing that we're going to be able to do when we judge meat, is look at that fat color as well. The next one we're going to look at is called marbling, and marbling is known as these fine flecks of fat that appear within the muscle of the meat. So we're not talking about this fat that goes around the outside of the muscle. We're talking about all these little flecks that are within the muscle. So that's known as marbling. And when we talk about marbling, we look at things whether it's got a really low marble score. So that's something that might only have a couple of flecks or very little flecks of that marbling or that fat within the meat. And then that score goes all the way up. And if you're really lucky to see something that's all the way up here, it's known more from our animals called, if you've ever heard of Wagyu beef, those animals actually produce cuts of meat that have really high levels of marbling. And it's a very big delicacy, especially in countries such as Japan. So that's one thing we can also do, is when we look at that piece of meat at the supermarket or whatever we've got in front of us, how many flecks of fat are in it and how marbled is it? And the reason we like marbling is because it adds more flavor. Fat adds flavor to it. So the more flecks it has, normally it's going to have a different flavor, might be more tasty. And if you have the opportunity to do the additional activity after this one, we'll see if you can even taste any differences between something that has lots of flecks of meat or something that's from a grass-fed animal versus a grain-fed animal. So we look at these three examples here. Hopefully we can work out for this one, it's got the lowest score of marbling, so there's not very many flecks in it, all the way up to this one that has lots of flecks, so a high level of marbling. So in some of the handouts, and there's a couple of different ones, so you've got some options to complete, and I know we've got a couple of different year groups that are joining us today. But when we judge meat, so we're looking at those different categories that we looked at before. So what color is the meat? So if you've got a couple of different samples that have been sent to you, you can work out, give it a score, or even write down, is it bright cherry red, or is it a more dark purple of a color? What color is the fat? So was it yellow, or was it more of that white? How much fat is there? Was there lots of fat or not very much? Was there any marbling? And ultimately, what do you think is going to taste the best? So we're going to make some assessments on those cuts of meat before we cook them, see whether you can work out which would taste the best based on what you think, whether it's meat color, maybe it's marbling, and then cook it up and see if you can tell any differences. So this is the other sheet that you could fill out as well. And so for some of our students, especially the ones that we sent some stuff to the Gippsland region, we've sent you two different samples. We've sent you things that are grass-fed and then are grain-fed. So you can actually make some assessments of those two different cuts of meat, where there's any difference in terms of that meat color, that fat color, the marbling, and which you think might also taste best. But if you don't have anything with you, that's also fine. Just find some photos after this, or I can use these slides and I can send them to you, and you can actually look and write down some differences between those grass-fed and the grain-fed, or at home, go through your freezer, see what you're having for dinner, even write down some differences in meat color, maybe for your chicken that you're eating, and then tomorrow maybe you're going to have a beef stir fry or something. So lots of different options for you to be able to do this activity. So we touched on some differences between grass and grain-fed. So for those that don't know, if it's a grass-fed animal, it's an animal that spends most of its time in the paddock consuming grass or consuming pasture. But also we can have animals that also spend some of their time eating grain. And so that's known as a grain-fed animal, or an animal that's finished on grain. And so maybe if you've gone to the supermarket, you might be able to see some differences in labels of the packaging, that it says grass-fed beef, maybe it says grain-fed beef. And so all it's to do with is what are we feeding that animal, but it can also have an impact on the actual meat that we look at. So we've got a slide here of a grain-fed piece of steak. and a grass-fed piece of steak. And so when we're judging meat, that first thing that we said we're going to look at is the color of the meat. And hopefully when you look at these two, you can see that there are some differences with the color of that meat. They're two different colors. It's not meaning that one's better or worse than the other, but just being able to identify that there are differences in terms of the color of that meat. And then if we look at the fat color as well, hopefully you can also see that there's some fat color differences. So when we look at our grass-fed animal, this fat that's here is more of a yellow color versus our grain-fed one that has that white colored fat meat. And so the reason for this yellowing, so it's a grass-fed animal, it's eating pasture, and what's actually found in our grass is beta carotene, and that actually makes that fat color go yellow. And so that's the main reason why we see some of those differences between a grass-fed and a grain-fed animal is just what it's eating. What is that animal consuming? We can also see if we look at marbling, remember we're giving everything a marbling score. And again, these are just two different examples. But we've got our grass-fed one here. You can see it's pretty much got no marbling. It's really hard to see any flecks of fat throughout that piece of meat. Where if we compare it to this particular example of this grain-fed one, we can see marbling. So all of these tiny little flecks of meat throughout that muscle there. So if we're going to make some comparisons between these two, what I would say is that this one has a darker colored meat. The fat color is whiter. Its marbling is also higher compared to our grass-fed one. And so they're just some of the differences when we talk about comparing meat or doing some meat judging that we can see between those two different ones. So that's your very basic introduction to meat judging. I can see we've got some questions online. So we've talked about marbling of the sign of an animal, whether it's a sign of high quality meat. So yes, so marbling, it can be a sign of high quality meat, but remember we all have different taste differences. So what you might like as a piece of steak might be different to the person sitting next to you. And so the whole point of this activity is being able to identify some of those differences that we see on a raw piece of meat. You work out what you think might taste the best, cooking it up and then seeing whether you are correct. And it's personal preference to what we prefer to eat, same as the different cuts of meat. In terms of an animal that might be unhealthy, when we talk about meat color, it's more, there's lots of different things that go into play in terms of the nutrition of the animal. Stress is also a big one, and handling. And so it's really important that when we send animals and take them off farm, that we make sure that all of our management practices are really low stress. So that animal's very low stressed as well as possible, because we know that that will have an effect on that meat quality at the end. And that'll also have an impact on our farmers in terms of what they actually get in terms of money from it. So some very good questions coming through. So we went through that meat color, we went through fat color, we looked at marbling. So there's just three things that we can look at from that raw piece of meat. The next activity, if you do have stuff with you, or if you want to complete it, you don't have to do it today, you could do it at another point in time as well, is making some assessment of that cooked meat as well. So you've cooked your meat, or you're going to cook your meat, or you're going to do it after dinner tonight. And now I want you to see if you could see any differences. So we saw that meat was that bright cherry red color. We've now cooked it up. What color is it now? Because it's not going, well, if you've cooked it properly, it shouldn't be still red or blue. It hopefully has some caramelization and a completely different color to it. What did it taste like? So was that piece of meat awful? Was it yum? And again, it's going to depend on the different cuts that we have and what you like best. Again, for the different handout, the other options to complete are things like tenderness. So how chewy was that piece of meat to eat? And so I'm sure we've all had a piece of meat that hasn't tasted very good, is really chewy, and so it isn't very tender. And so for tenderness, I'd probably say that it wasn't very tender. I didn't have a good eating experience. Appearance, we know when we look at things on a plate visually, that also has a really big influence in terms of whether I want to eat it or not. And so looking at its appearance, does it look good? And then finally, taste. And again, there's no right or wrong for this because we all have different preferences for what we like to eat, but which one tasted best? And so ideally, if you can have a couple of different types of meat, whether it's a grain-fed or a grass-fed, or maybe it's chicken, a pork and a beef, I want you to see if you can taste some differences, because you should be able to taste some differences between each of those different meats and between different quality of meat as well. And then finally, which did you actually like best? Again, to see whether it was related to any of those other characteristics that we looked at around meat color or marbling and flavor. So I know it's been a very brief introduction, but we've just tried to keep that first bit nice and short so that you've got the rest of this half an hour or whatever time frame that you've got to either cook up some meat or think about how we make some assessments for some different characteristics. So if you don't have any meat with you, that's completely fine. Just Google some images of grass-fed versus grain-fed and use those handouts and those color chips to work out what is the color of that piece of meat, what is the fat color, which one had the most marbling, and which do you actually think might taste the best. We still have a couple of minutes for any questions. If anyone, I know we've hopefully answered some that have already come through the chat, but if I've missed any, or if you want to unmute yourself, you're more than welcome to ask a question. This is just one of our activities for our virtual National Science Week. We've also got a dairy science panel this week and also a horticultural panel. And then we're running this activity again later in the week as well. So hopefully some different opportunities for you, regardless of where you're based in Australia this week.
Hi, how are we going, Jamie?
Hello, good.
That's good. Our students just had a question.
Yes.
When we had our grain fed, which the bag says it's grain fed, a bit of steak.
Yep.
And the other one, according to the diagram, the grain was darker.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
And
It depends. So for that particular example, it was, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be the case for every single grain versus grass-fed piece of meat that you have. Remember, we're going to have very big differences when we talk about animals or breeds. So similar to a breed of dog, there's all these different breeds of dogs, and it's the same for our beef animals or our cows as well. So there's all these different breeds, and they're all going to have very different quality of meat. So it's going to depend on where that animal came from. Yours might have come from local Gippsland region, which hopefully means you can have a really good piece of steak. Up here, my steak's going to be very different because it's coming from a different breed of animal.
So there's no real way of telling if you got two bits of meat together unless the butcher just says that one's grain fed and that one's grass. Is there? Or
normally the main difference would be the fat color. But when we talk about grain-fed pieces of meat, the time frame that an animal can be on grain varies greatly. So it could just be a short period, or it could be an extended period of its life, and that's going to influence that fat color and that marbling in the meat as well. So bring your meats closer, and anyone else that's on can also see what we've got here as well. So we've got two different cuts of meat. So for the fat color for those, there's not very much difference between those two.
that is darker.
That's darker?
The grass is darker, yep.
Perfect. So our grass-fed normally, it has a bit more of that yellowing colour of that fat versus the white of our grain-fed.
Yep.
And then for the meat colour, is there some slight differences? It's always very hard on a camera to see.
There is a huge difference with the colouring and the marbling.
Okay, so which one would you say had a more bright cherry red, more appealing colour?
Would be the grass.
The grass. Okay. And there's no right or wrong for that. That's fine. So then what about for marbling? Is there any marbling within each of those cuts?
The grass again would have to be more marbled, I'd say.
No way. No, I disagree completely, because you look over on this one and it's really, the colour's really even.
Yep.
And there's lots of marbling all the way through the grain.
Okay, that's a bit better. Let me, I'll just spotlight this one. So for anyone else that wants to see.
Oh, wait, that's on.
Here we are. Perfect.
Oh, yeah, it's on.
Okay, so for everyone else that's also joined, you can see some differences between these two cuts of meat. Perfect. So now you're just going to fill in your sheet work out what some of the different color differences between those two are, the fat color differences, and then also the marbling. And then you're all going to have a different opinion, but I want you all to say which one you would personally prefer to eat, and then see once you've cooked it, if that you were correct. Again, there's no right or wrong. We all prefer different things, but make some assessment and then cook it up and see if there were any taste differences between the two. But no, I'm glad at least there's some differences between them. That's good.
Thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
We'll go back on mute and start cooking.
Okay, enjoy. I'm a bit jealous I'm not eating some meat right now. Was there any other questions for anyone that's online? No? Perfect. We've got all of our team's email address. So if you do have any other questions or need help with anything, get in touch with us, use the handouts available, or hopefully you can join us for some of our other sessions for some careers in dairy or our careers in the horticulture sector as well. Thanks, everyone.